Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 40, and we're going to talk about the fall of Threads, Instagram, and misinformation again. So Threads, if you haven't been following the news, was a new app released by Meta, Instagram, and it was supposed to rival Twitter. It's a text-based conversation app, and it was supposed to be tied to Instagram. People called it the Twitter killer. And the reason why Threads, I guess, was brought back, right? It was discontinued in 2021 and then has been brought back because so many people were rage quitting Twitter because Elon Musk took over and he clearly is a Nazi. And so they don't feel safe anymore. And so they quit using Twitter. And so Zuckerberg decided that he was going to create something where they could all go. And apparently I was surprised to, and I did a little research, and I was surprised to see that there were a couple other competitors to Twitter in the past, but this seemed like a real threat. A lot of, or several at least, computer savvy geeks, some computer websites were hyping it up. They were saying, oh, it's going to be awesome. And so July 7th, I guess that's when a lot of the articles came out and said, oh, yeah, this is going to be awesome. And then the first 5 days that you could download Threads, there were over 100 million downloads. So one might think that even if half of them actually installed the app onto their device, you got 50 million people right from, starting with a bang. But then as of July 20th, that's today when I'm recording this, the time that people spent on Threads, the average time was 21 minutes, and it dropped to 6 minutes. Now, it could come back probably if they made some changes to it, if there's some radical changes and improvements to the app. It could make a comeback, but it seems like it's on its way out. The head of Instagram Threads said that Threads would not bolster news and political content, but it would adhere strictly to rules that stifle the explicit dark humor, which is common on Twitter. And that's a near quote, not an actual quote, but it's quite near. And so a lot of people were using it and they were like, oh, okay, safe space. And well, as it turns out, I think I like the explicit dark humor that's common on Twitter. And that was kind of really interesting, is that all those people who supposedly were upset about Musk, that's probably not the reason why they rage quit. It's probably more likely, and this is just conjecture on my part, because I just started using Twitter and eating into a lot of my time of the day, but trying to learn how to use it. But it seems that a lot of people who originally left Twitter, they need Twitter as an outlet for all of their anger and all of their hate, and they crave the attention that they get from doing whatever it is that they do. And so it's probable that the reason why they left Twitter was that now people could push back, right? So where their subjectivity dominated and any opposing subjectivities were kicked off, pushed down in the priority algorithms and all this other kind of stuff. And so they weren't as visible, they weren't highlighted, promoted in some way. And so therefore they got to feel like they were masters of the universe. But, now that people could push back, maybe, they were like, wow, this is just so not cool anymore. And so they left. But surprise, surprise, they probably came back. A lot of people who I read, and these are just anecdotes of people who tried to use Threads, found it really frustrating. They were constantly being asked, are you sure you want to follow this person? This person, is a frequent misinformation source, whatever. And so they were getting a lot of that. And so people just stopped using it. So it took less than 2 weeks for the word to get out that Threads, barring some massive changes to the app, is basically not a place to go. So that information would continue to highlight how awesome Threads was and more people should use it. But this bad information must stand in contrast with competing information, which is represented by Twitter itself, right? So Twitter, the competing app, the competing arena for information, holds Threads accountable. And so now you can compare what is the better or the better app. But also then the so-called misinformation that is so widely available now on Twitter may not be widely believed to be misinformation. And so we need competing platforms, one might even say, to simplify, a competing competition of information so that people can figure out what is better and what is not as good, like less good, right? So we'll do even subtle differences between better and less bad, right? So the speed is something which is remarkable as well. 100 people to suddenly get the realization that maybe it's not as good as Twitter. I mentioned before that the speed of the rumor mill, the phone tree, or whatever old school method that you use to spread information, that was pretty fast too, but it's even faster now, right? So we have just technology, we have the internet, and so news travels very, very quickly. And you will have people on the internet who are willing to sacrifice their time and their energy, maybe even their Instagram account, to test out Threads in the hopes of spreading more information. People do that. It's kind of interesting. And the vast majority of people seek better, right? They're always looking for something better for whatever reason, for whatever motivation. It's not like they're all looking for something else for the same reason, but they're looking for something else. And the majority get to express, right? And so we get to see what most people believe is better simply by, in this case, what app they are using. We also see then a lot of people commenting, doing reviews, but we also see people who are pumping it, right? So there are proponents of Threads and there are people who are trying to be critical of it. And as things play out, we should always remember who were the people that were pumping it, who were the people saying, oh no, but it's good anyway, and who were the people who were giving a more measured, kind of even tempered kind of evaluation of the new app. And in the future, see those sources become more reliable over time, right, through multiple reviews, until finally you listen to people who are consistent in the way that they evaluate. And so just like this podcast, what it's trying to do is trying to illustrate how you can find better information, right? So I try not to try to give a conclusion like this is what you got to do, because it's up to us, right? And I certainly don't know everything. All I'm trying to do is look at some events that happen in our society today and try to give some food for thought, right? And maybe even inspire some people to develop an idea, to take it to the next level and provide a product or a good which can improve a lot of people's lives. Now, interestingly, it's when government decides that they're going to start some kind of protection agency, some oversight organization, bureaucracy, to make things safer, to make sure that we have accurate information, so we know something is trustworthy, reliable, etc. So a lot of people, once they hear that the government is going to do something and it has that seal of approval, then people stop doing research, right? They just say, well, the government said it's safe, so therefore it must be safe. And so I don't need to do any kind of research. This is why people don't research banks anymore, because there's FDIC insurance. And then every once in a while, the Fed, or I guess it's the FDIC, or whatever organization is there to oversee just the banking phenomena. They'll test banks, right? And if they pass the test, then, oh, okay, that means they're safe. And so once the government comes into the picture and tells everyone it's perfectly fine, anything else that anyone says, it's going to be fake news, right? And so if the government officials say, oh, no, the banking system is safe, and then you have some people say, oh, no, no, they're about to go bankrupt, then who's the fake news, right? Who's the misinformation? And that is what is really interesting. And so we have an SEC, Security Exchange Commission, which is charged with making sure that there are no Ponzi schemes or any kind of funny business happening on the stock market. But even with the SEC, we had a Bernie Madoff who ran a Ponzi scheme for years, ripped off a lot of wealthy, connected, influential people. And so how do they do it? When we had an oversight committee and the government trying to figure out who's to blame while not blaming itself, suggested, I didn't follow the story after that, but they suggested that they needed an oversight committee for the SEC, right? So watchers of the watchers. So basically layers of bureaucracy is what is being proposed. And then more recently, we had FTX and Bankman-Fried, SBF. And basically we saw there a lot of people in government just pumping FTX, and which basically drew in a lot of people, even some people that I know put all their money in there. I didn't know they were doing it. I would have said something if I knew, but nevertheless, they did it and they lost everything. So what we need then is a competition of information. So, and if we go back to the Threads Twitter competition, competition was permitted. I mean, Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion. He's already connected with the government, right? Because Tesla was, I think it's heavily subsidized by the government. It was for a very long time, probably still is. If Threads was really successful, then Twitter becomes worthless, right? If Threads became everything that it had promised, then Twitter becomes a nothing. And so then Musk loses all of his investment, right? So most people would not be able to handle that threat and that risk of losing everything. And so they would go to their favorite politician and say, you got to pass a regulation to prevent a new competing entity. Something Amazon has done this already. This is why foreign, online marketplaces find it so difficult to enter into the U.S. market because there are a lot of regulations. I don't know exactly what they are, but the highly successful businesses in Asia, like Alibaba and whatever they're using in Korea, is not allowed to enter into the United States. And if they are, it's very restricted, heavily controlled, so that Amazon maintains its market share. But Musk did, as far as I know, did nothing. He allowed Threads to be released and then watch it crash and burn. That takes a lot, right? And I give him props for that. But a lot of people can't. And so in order to have legislation passed, they will spread disinformation or propaganda to justify the legislation, which hinders competitors from even getting off the ground. And so they'll spin subjectivity and they'll promote the positive aspects of this new legislation, new regulation. And so other opinions, other subjectivities are suppressed in this way. Government agencies have a huge track record of doing this. Regulatory capture would be one expression, where the government agency basically takes over the entire industry and their favorites are allowed to continue to exist while all other competitors basically die on the vine. So government agencies generally do a horrible job protecting us from misinformation. So should we fear misinformation? Well, the reality is that there's a lot of information, subjective information out there. And not all information is absolutely evil, like no one should ever hear it, because obviously information is there to be known. And how we feel about that information is always going to be subjective. But in the example that I just gave you with the threads and the Twitter, if information is allowed to flow and we can have access to a lot of it if we wanted, then it becomes clear very quickly what is good information and what is not as good. And then people make their choice. I've made a horrible large number of mistakes through life, where I have a very impulsive personality. I'll believe something right away and rush to take all these actions, make all these choices, and then realize that I made a mistake. So I've been embarrassed a lot, greatly, and yeah. So, but I learned my lesson, and every time I got burned, I made sure that the next time I would always say, okay, wait, that sounds too good to be true. Or what's the downside risk? What else is there? What am I missing here? And so I always challenge that information. And you can't do that if there are censorships or bans, as we discussed in episode 32. So here are some signs. So, you know, as I just said, so there's always going to be misinformation. There's nothing that we can do to stop it. But rather than call it misinformation, we'll say it less than good information. There's the good stuff, and then there's stuff that's not as good. And depending on what's at stake, what's at risk, well, that determines just how bad that information is. Okay, so we'll just leave it in that generic, broad understanding. So then what would be important might be how to spot like danger signals, signs that the information that you're hearing is extremely subjective. And so therefore you're going to miss a lot of details, which would, at the end of it all, make someone conclude that it was misinformation or bad information. I mean, information is information. It's going to benefit someone, right? So whether something is good or bad is always going to be subjective. So for the wide audience, how do you know that the information that you're hearing is extremely subjective? It's going to benefit someone, and it's probably not you. Well, the first sign is when government and corporate media, they're all saying the same thing. And these days, pretty much with the same exact words, the same phrases, you know, then you know something strange is going on. There was a comedian, he passed away not that long ago, George Carlin. He said that bipartisan cooperation is the kind of cooperation which signals to everyone that's a larger than usual deception is taking place. I believe he used profanity, but I'll keep it clean in this podcast. So, but if you think about it, any kind of legislation is a reduction of choice. It's an imposition. It's imposing a narrow subjectivity on everybody. They don't want you to see better ideas. I think I mentioned one of the earlier episodes, I was in a conversation with a business school professor when we were having this sort of collaboration between humanities and business school. Yeah. But I, you know, just sort of to test the waters, I said, yeah, you know, a lot of the best ideas are criminalized. And I think it took him a while to process that, you know, because I went right away to illegal behavior. And I think it kind of shocked him a little bit. But there it is. So legislation prevents us from even thinking about better ideas. And so that's a danger sign right there. Whenever liability is waived, right? Whenever a company is promised that they will not be held responsible for side effects, which may include death, pollution, whatever. Whenever liability is somehow restricted, limited, regulated, or even just flat out waived, then you're going to have serious issues. A lot of people have a problem with government, especially when it lies, and millions of people die. You know, when the government says that there are weapons of mass destruction in another country, and it turns out there are none. Well, then, and you killed 1 million people there. Oops, you know, but there's no liability, right? If any of us were to do the same thing, I mean, we'd be the most evil person uh, that has lived on the earth for a long time. That haven't seen someone so evil in a while. But when government does it, they have sovereign immunity, right? Because they're the ruler, they're the government. They meant well, and they made a mistake. You can't hold them responsible for that. Oh yeah, you should, and they should be held responsible for all of the consequences of the bad legislation that they support. So there's that. So police, the problem with police is they have qualified immunity, and so there you have problems as well. The third sort of tip off that something is really shady is when someone says, hey, it's a win-win, right? Okay, sometimes maybe, but you always should have a plan B. You should always have a backup plan. You should always hedge your bets, as they say. So don't go all in, just in case it turns out to be a bad deal. You still have something left. Always make sure you have a hedge. Also, keep in mind that when there's not the best information is being shared, then having discussions on other ideas is not allowed, right? So other views, in the same way that other ideas are criminalized through legislation, you're not even allowed to go there. But if you're in a conversation and then all of a sudden certain people are canceled, then obviously there's a serious problem here. When the government weaponizes its bureaucracies to go after people who voice and express opinions which go against government policy or government positions, then something really shady is happening. We saw this happening in Canada, where Trudeau basically started investigating the financial dealings of everyone in the trucker convoy, tried to make their lives miserable. Then something shady is going on. When the government abuses its power to go after its enemies, and we see that happening in the United States right now, the sitting president doing something very similar, while they're guilty of far greater crimes, using the bureaucracies of the government to go after other people. And these other people, I don't even really care for them that much, but it is unjust. It is an abuse of power. And it doesn't matter if I like them or don't like them. It's just, even my worst enemy, I would not, I'd feel really uncomfortable if injustice was, enacted on them. That was something that I was bullied a lot when I was younger, but I never wanted to see the bully be victims of injustice. That didn't seem right. All right. So basically, the conclusion is that the government basically is the largest major source of misinformation, more than anything else in all of society. I've given lots of examples in previous episodes. I don't think we talked about cholesterol, but the cholesterol fighting drugs like Lipitor, Crestor, Zetia, they used to be advertised on TV like every 10 minutes. Like you couldn't get through a commercial break. I mean, if you weren't doing a streaming service or whatever, you couldn't get through a commercial break without seeing a cholesterol fighting drug commercial. And it turns out that it was all a lie, that it's sugar which causes heart disease risk and clogged arteries and all this other kind of stuff. But forget about that. You need this cholesterol fighting drug, and they changed the food pyramid. They changed all the dietary guidelines. They forced food manufacturers to change the way they do it. They forced restaurants to put up fat contents on all their menus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that was so that they could prop up the sugar cartel and sort of go after all that delicious food that had loads and loads of fat. Okay, so that's it. So really, we should be afraid of the government whenever they say that they will protect us from misinformation. Well, that's it for this episode, and I will talk to you in the next one.